Well, in 1996, I would have been in my mid-teenage years, and I remember we had at home we had one shared PC computer that must have arrived somewhere around that time, and it was in the corner of my parents' bedroom. Um, and there was no meaningful like computer or anything you could use at school. It wasn't that, and I wasn't really someone who was interested or in video games or anything like that. So the computer for me, its main attraction was this kind of utopic fever that had started to sort of people would talk about around this idea of a world wide web. That was the thing. It was like this portal to this thing that people called a world wide web. I had no idea what it meant. But I remember that with that fever, there was a sense of it was limitless, this world wide web. It was free, and you could have different kinds of community. And I found that cocktail really exciting. I remember that being really exciting in the middle of the 90s. And with that excitement, I remember there being this idea of a future where you would have possibly total access to all knowledge. I remember that being like a fantasy or an idea or something, but that knowledge would be coded as information. And I think up to that point in my life, I don't think I'd ever thought about information, really. I didn't really like school. I wasn't particularly bright or anything. It wasn't, it wasn't really for me. So, but that cocktail of these promises and that sense of a future of access to all information was really exciting. But I didn't know what it would mean to me, to communities I was already involved in, let alone to the sort of bigger world. But I guess probably my quite small, closeted sense of the bigger world was forming around things I was reading, which would at that time would have been, this is kind of embarrassing to admit, but things like New Internationalist magazine, New Humanist magazine, Prospect magazine, The Guardian, so this pretty straight kind of Western humanist liberal idealism that was big in the 90s, and the 90s in Britain were quite exciting. Like they felt like fertile, like future looked good in the 90s in Britain. That's all I can tell you. So that strange kind of liberal cocktail of things I was reading was shaping, I guess, my sense of what that free, open, limitless future might be like. And like all teenagers, it was probably that heady mix of contradictions. The world you think you want, as best you can understand it, and the world as it seems to be, and the two things not really lining up. So I guess my first exposure to Ubu would have been an exposure as much to Kenneth Goldsmith's very early turn from sculpture into poetry, and the connection to that poetry community through a kind of international artist book kind of network. From memory, there was a kind of email, Jiskmail type sharing space, which was big and popular pretty quickly. I wasn't actually involved in that, but with a dear friend who was in England, I had this kind of second-hand exposure. And then meeting Kenneth, I guess this is like 2004, 2005, something like that. And just seeing Ubu Web, seeing the scale of possibility of someone who knew how to use a computer, bringing things together in one space, which is something, I guess, in my crude imagination, I'd only thought possible in institutions. It wasn't possible to put Yoko Ono next to John Cage, next to, other rare records, next to film, unless you had like loads of money, loads of space, etc. Even the very idea that you could do it was like a complete leap to me. That and its unapologetically kind of refined neo-constructivist aesthetic, black, red, white, loads of typeset space. It felt good. It was much better to look at than most of the other things that were around. Maybe there's something to say about going forwards, but it also functioned much better than most institutional web resources, like embarrassingly so, I would say, for those institutions. So with limited means but a clear aesthetic sense, you could do something that really outgunned big institutional budgets or planning procedures. Definitely at that time, I wouldn't have had any idea about whether or not UbuWeb was unique or there were loads of things like it. I just didn't know where to find them, right? Again, World Wide Web, but how do you navigate it? Where do you find things? That's beyond me. So, but what I did know is that like there was a gravitational pull. It was a niche, but it was my niche. I love that stuff, and I was in. So, so I think, you know, certainly between then and now, I definitely developed a dependency on UbuWeb and things like UbuWeb to service that desire and that drive, that attraction to get access to the kinds of cultural expression that I value. I can't now in 2024, I can't imagine servicing that desire in me without all of these, you know, what I see now as a bigger field of archives and libraries, shadow libraries, etc., that service the niche interests of people like me. But my dependency, I would say, the dependency definitely that I've developed is pretty clumsy. I would call it clumsy. And it's mostly one way in the sense that I don't meaningfully contribute or upload or help grow these kinds of archives. And my dependency has really become one that's, I'm totally attracted to the immediate access of it via high-speed internet connections. I'm really excited by, and I remember being excited by at the time, this idea that you could make transversal subjective connections. Like, you could be there for one reason, but I'd really like the connection between whatever, John Cage and Maria Eichhorn or something like that. Like, I could make my own connections from within the archive. And that still is super important to me. But also, again, a thing that's particularly important for me around UbuWeb is that whenever you're following the taste of the person or people who craft the particular selections and collections, and like an art critic or anything else, you sort of decide whether you have similar taste. And I had similar taste. So I was excited when new things would go up there. Like, I might not know who they are, I might not, but I know that I trust the taste of the people who are putting them there. And that remains really important to me. So maybe where that feverish fantasy of all knowledge everywhere was sort of surfacing in the 90s, I'm much more interested in discretion and being discriminate about that now. Like, I'm interested in following tastes and communities of taste. But I think it's really healthy. Like, one of the things that I notice now, becoming more aware more recently of, a broader community of archiving practices, let's say things like Monoscope, shadow libraries, memory of the world, but also like CAMP in India and other kinds of communities of archiving practices. The growing edges, around the edges of these things, the growing sort of meta-discussion about the importance of dealing with clumsy dependency is really, really important. And maybe most important for people like me who don't speak the technical language of computing and stuff like that. So, but beginning to talk openly about the vulnerability of these systems relative to exactly what makes them unique is, I think, one of the most important cultural discourses opening up now. I think the bringing to surface from the inside out of some expression about the vulnerability of these systems is really, really important. And a risky activity for those on the inside, I imagine, but really, really important, because a sense that we, all of us who use these systems, need to start sharing some responsibility for the inner workings seems absolutely essential to them having any kind of future, right? But to move from that kind of black box to the open box, or from, to be able to see the inside and understand the labor, the craft, the technical and the technique needed to maintain, but also just the sheer effort and the practices of effort that are needed. It seems just crucial. I just can't imagine like how there's any kind of future for these things if the demand of their upkeep isn't somehow shared. So how do you move from like a meta-politics that's all about hiding and the shadow, to a metapolitics that's about the right kind of openness. I don't want to use the word transparency, but the right kind of openness that has vulnerability written into the kind of discourse, the way it's talked about, but also has something like simplicity wherever possible in the technical upkeep of the things. That twin is the way forward. I don't know way forward, but it's how it looks from the outside like a really important pathway to moving forwards in a sustainable way. But the future's, I don't know. I mean, like, well, is this a curse or a blessing? I don't know. But generally in life, I'm an optimist. So that's my sin. Maybe that's a really dumb thing to be in sight of the world right now. I don't know. In like the evidence of the world. But I'm an optimist, if only for my own sanity and like as a parent. Like I want the future to be tolerable at least. So when I think about UbuWeb, I can't help but think of it as itself a cultural act, like as itself a composed construction, as itself a kind of cultural expression that functions a bit like some kind of durational performance. In a sense, I think it's not made. I think it's made with a different promise from other kinds of archives, in that I don't see like a promise of permanence ever being written into it. I don't think it's much closer to the playlist on your computer, I think. It's like a thing, like right now, where's my excitement? And I think it has that same sort of temporality, a kind of unbounded temporariness. But I think what's really important to my understanding of UbuWeb has always been referenced in the URL, right? Like it's Alfred Jarry. And in Jarry's trilogy of Ubu plays, we get the best demonstration probably of what he would later come to call pataphysics. So pataphysics as a kind of imaginary science, this practice of developing imaginary answers to imaginary questions as a form of speculative act. And so in a sense, I think we can see UbuWeb as a direct exercise in pataphysical invention, right? Like, and it asks, and to do that, its imaginary question is to ask, well, what if copyright didn't exist? And I think it's organizing, I don't want to say logic, but it's organizing impulse. And so I guess my optimism in terms of digital archives and shadow libraries and things like UbuWeb in the future is totally rooted in that sense of it coming from a speculative imagination. And the optimism's twofold for me. One, it's that other people will keep asking that same question, like what if copyright didn't exist? Like what if we saw these archives as one way of continuing an ongoing challenge to the regimes of intellectual property and the cultural enclosures that uphold a kind of false promise in relation to capitalist growth ideas about who can and should have access to our shared culture. You know, I want more people to keep asking that question in different ways. That's part of my optimism. And like in tow with that, the second side of my optimism is really that different people in different places with different interests will keep emerging and see UbuWeb not as a template, but as a prototype or like a permission that they can do exactly the same with their interests, their communities, and in their directions. And so in the spirit of a kind of pataphysical gesture, like what if we tried, you know, to make a space where we could all talk about this other niche thing that we care about. And so my sense of like, okay, Ubu in the future, the pluralization of your Ubus is really important. I don't know if Ubu will still be there on a computer. I can go on a computer and access UbuWeb in 40 years. I don't know. I mean, maybe it'd be great if it was, but the world doesn't end if it doesn't. What matters is that it seeds the possibility that people could go and do these things without massive institutional means, but hopefully in a way that learns from that meta-debate emerging now around this whole wider culture of digital archives and shadow libraries, which says that we've got to bake in a more honest discussion about their maintenance, their upkeep, and the care, the culture of care that they need from their users as well as their makers, right? So how could we have this maybe more sensible meta-politics of simplicity and vulnerability baked into those future Ubus so that they weren't quite as fragile.